Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Halper, and I'm here to talk about academic prototypes to the first-in-human kind of pipeline. I think my focus of the talk today is trying to get us to think about where proof of concept work that we work on in our academic careers kind of meets, I don't know, rubber to the road or whatever, when we actually get into translating devices into commercial med tech. I guess to start with a little bit of vulnerability, I feel a little stressed today. My whole team is working on a really big phase closure for our company, and I wish I could be there with them. So a little stressed, but very happy to be here with you. I think to start, I can note that I've made a career out of translation. That said, my translation has always been focused on the very beginning stages of it. So moving from a concept that's in the lab to its first implantation in its first few humans. And so because of that, I have a specific bias, I guess, with how I think about translation and where things kind of fall apart or get difficult. But it's also been something that's let me see a bunch of different technologies over a kind of wide span of projects, because I've gotten to meet with a lot of founders early. We get into first in human, then I go to the next founder. And so I've been working with a bunch of different people over the course of my career. And so I've been able to pull from a number of different experiences. So the three concepts I want to talk about today are translation challenges themselves. I think a lot of people see translation as a phase of development, and that somehow translations fail due to bad early scientific experiments or something like that. I want to correct that a little bit and look at where translation typically falls apart when we're pulling things from academic labs. I'll talk a little bit about design, and that being the actually starting point for translation failure. So again, emphasizing that point that translation is not just a phase, it's a stress test of every assumption we've made previously. And then I'll talk about academic science and the mismatch it has, I think, with translation sometimes. That doesn't mean they're fundamentally incompatible, but I kind of want to point at the differences between them. So to give maybe a little bit of history to my career, just coming back to this slide, in context of those 3 points. I graduated with a neuroscience degree and desperately wanted to work at a neurotech company. I really wanted to work at BlackRock here in Utah, in Salt Lake City, and was trying to apply to roles there, but didn't really know how to get in. They didn't have anything posted. So I pulled the boomer move of walking into their front doors with my resume in my hand, and I handed it to the front desk person, and they never called me back. And I then later went on to try to do this again by applying to a position that I felt like maybe I was a little bit overqualified for, which is a manufacturing technician position, and they never responded to me. So I then tried to go and apply to a position I was completely unqualified for. It required a PhD and all these years and experience with microelectrode technology that I didn't have, and they somehow called me back. And so I took that opportunity to try to show them that I could be PhD level thinker, and read through the dissertations of everybody who interviewed me to try to talk to them about their work, and eventually got the job. Working at BlackRock, I effectively started as tech support, but fancy tech support, right? We're doing brain surgery. And so I worked through that tech support job, helping and working with a lot of different customers and meeting a lot of different people. And I think the thing that I took away from my experience at BlackRock is the kind of breadth of experience that I got. I got to work in lots of different parts of the company and lots of different areas. I worked in tech support, I got to work in product, I got to work in sales, I got to work in manufacturing, I got to work in finance. And I got to apply these skills in companies that I got to start or work on in the future. And so most of this experience has been done through both my work at BlackRock and the customers that we served, because we served as an engineering development firm for a lot of different companies and academics, but also through the consulting work I did after and some of the experience that came later. So that's where this stuff kind of comes from and what it's rooted in. Today, my role is at Motif, I work as our Chief Operating Officer, which basically means I handle everything that's not engineering. So I work in regulatory, quality, manufacturing, but I also help us develop some of our testing and have been involved in device design at Motif as well. So my plan is to talk about a few different case studies today as I go through these sort of translation pipelines. The first of these is the core case study, which is Motif Neurotech itself. We're working on a chronic implant that provides epidural stimulation of the DLPFC, so kind of frontal cortex part of the brain, for treating depression. So it has two main components I'll talk about. The implant itself, which, as you can see, sits epidurally, just in the bone, and just under the skin. So it's fully implanted and wirelessly communicated with through an external wearable. Motif has some cool stuff in it, proprietary wireless technology, et cetera. I'm not going to focus on that too much, but it'll show up in a few places. There's another accessory case study I'll come back to pretty often. These are the chronic thin film electrodes we developed at BlackRock in collaboration with a professor that had developed this thin film electrode technology in his lab, and the kind of challenge we had with translating that eventually failed, but then succeeded at Neuralink. And then I'll talk about a few accessory examples, challenges we've had with sterilization, FDA recalls, and kind of funny usability stories from the clinic. So starting with one of the first challenges in translation, when we're building proof of concepts in the lab, one of the things we're often optimizing for is building something that can survive a benchtop experiment or a lab experiment that fits within our PhD, within our course, within our summer research project. And so these things often, by their very nature, end up being subchronic. So often less than 30 days or maybe less than 90 days, usually in animal studies, usually in controlled environments. And the biggest deal is that it's a small team of users, right? You have your few lab mates or the few people that are kind of putting these devices together or getting them to work. And so there's really fun things about the proof of concept stage. There's the finickiness, but the reward of seeing the signal show up on the screen when you had to like jiggle the electrode or like reinsert the thing 5 times. But those are the same factors that are kind of the fun dopamine hits of proof of concept are like the things that kill bringing those devices over into stable medical device. Because stable medical devices are very well characterized by very long implant lifetimes, unpredictable humans in like home environments or really varied environments. And those things can be challenging to ultimately the design of the things that we're working on. But I think the main challenge comes primarily from interfacing. This is not a new concept, and I kind of feel bad saying it to you because I think a lot of you have thought about the interfaces of neural devices and the challenges those present. But I think some of these might be a little bit unexpected, or at least not thought about very often. So of course, the one that we think about frequently is the electrode itself, if we're using an electrode-based technology, and what it interfaces with. So we think about biocompatibility, toxicity, the ability for the implant to not damage neurons. Those are a thing and they're important. But there's other places that we encounter challenges in translation. One of these is the connections between components of your device. So I think Vanessa Tolosa or others maybe have lectured enough over the last like 6 or 7 years that people really think about connector interfaces at this point. There was a long time there where we had really high density electrodes and really capable internal compute and devices, but no way to connect the two. And that's been an interface that academics and industry have like worked on to correct over time. And we see some of that success in a company like Neuralink that can bond thousands of electrodes to an implantable device now. So these interfaces are thought about often. I think some of the ones that we don't think about in the lab quite as much are the enclosures themselves and how we protect electronics that we have. Crossing over tissue boundaries and what kind of motion between tissue boundaries looks like. So if you take a device and you're crossing through dura, or you're crossing across brain layers, or maybe you're in a blood vessel like Synchron and now they want to go out of the blood vessel and you're crossing out of it. These types of like movements between these tissues are really difficult. And the more that you can get your device to sit in a single tissue type to prevent that type of micro motion or movement can be a really important aspect of its design to simplify the types of challenges you have to deal with later. We have material issues. So for example, any sort of mated surfaces or places that materials are bonding together is a point of stress and difficulty. And it's something you have to think about when designing a device. And we'll look at a device example on the next page. Communications, we've talked a little bit about this, how you actually communicate or interface with the device, what kind of distance you can communicate over, where the wearable has to be present. And then of course, like the user interface aspect itself, that's an interface. How you deal with the usability of your device, who's able to use it, the types of people that it works well for. I have a sort of unfortunate incident in my life where I was developing an eye tracker. I worked on it for several months and it was beautiful. I could get 100% like really accurate eye tracking. I'm blonde haired and blue eyed, handed it to my friend, brown hair, brown eyes, and didn't work at all. And I think there's these very easy kind of places of failure that it's hard to, or easy to forget maybe the right people that are using it and the challenges you might come up with. So I have a few different case studies or examples that I want to go over on these different interface types or these different challenges. I'll cover this one quickly because I think it's well understood by most of the people in this room. But of course, one of our first challenges in interfacing with or interacting with the brain are just glia or some of the reactive kind of products they produce. So when you insert an electrode into the brain, you get this glial scarring effect. They bond onto the electrode or encase or protect the foreign body. And this can affect your stimulation capability, how well your device can transmit energy to the brain, how well it can pick up signals from the brain. This is a pretty well understood concept, and there's all sorts of things that we've done to try to develop around it. You can develop devices that are really small and kind of don't activate the glia. You can develop coatings that discourage the glia from bonding. You can just blast through the glia by stimulating through them. There's all sorts of different approaches we can take, but that type of thinking has to show up very early in your device design. So if you're putting together, for example, an electrode with specific size or specific impedance, you have to be able to sort of plot or plan what this glial scarring amount will look like on your type of device so that you can develop it with the right back-end stimulation power and parameters and tools such that it can put out enough energy to be able to conquer this effect or beat this effect. And that's, again, a very easy thing to forget in a bench program because you usually have unlimited energy available to you. You're stimulating through an on-the-shelf stimulator that's sitting off to the side of your animal study or something, and you're not dealing with the limitations of battery power or the efficiency of your electronics in an implant or the small form factor you have to deal with. And so oftentimes we end up developing these electrodes that work well in this vacuum, but just really don't translate well to something like an implantable or permanently implantable technology. Another example of an interface that I worked on that was very difficult was an implant that was meant to be inserted transphenoidally, basically through the nose up into the pituitary gland. This is not a picture of the device itself. We didn't take any as we were working on this project. But one of the challenges we had was in how you got a device that was interfacing to the pituitary to not move, right? This was for patients who were dealing with terminal cancer pain. And so this pituitary stimulation provided a pain relief effect. But you had to be able to somehow hold this device in place, not have the patient rip it out of their head. And so interfacing here became a big challenge. The electrodes were off the shelf and really well understood. Our stimulator could be externalized, so we didn't have to worry about power. But how you affix this device and where it could be affixed safely and dealing with that sort of risk of explant or accidental explant was a challenging one. But I want to point at the motif device as an example of dealing with interfaces or trying to simplify dealing with interfaces. So as mentioned earlier, the motif device sits epidurally, so it sits on top of the dura and stimulates across the dura, and just sits in the bone of the skull. And then over the top of it is the skin or fascia. And this has made this device really easy to develop. we didn't have to worry about a lot of the challenges that come with implantable neurotechnologies. It doesn't move a lot because it's not sitting inside of pumping blood vessels, for example. It kind of affixes to the side of the skull, so it doesn't move up and down very much with the dura. And it doesn't need to cross any sort of skin barriers or migrate leads anywhere because it's powered externally. And so unlike a DBS device where you have to route leads down to an IPG in the chest, this device is much simpler. And this is where we kind of come into this idea of translation or developing to simplify translation. By some measures, the Motif device is pretty boring. It's a 3-electrode neurostimulator. It's like a little cylinder. It doesn't look that cool. It doesn't route leads to very many places. It's made to be simplistic, and that's part of the reason that we like it, the FDA likes it, the surgeons like it, because it doesn't cross very many of these interfaces. The total number of interfaces on the device are simplified. And that's true of at least how it interfaces with the body, but not necessarily true about the inside of the device. So this is a sort of exploded view of our neurostimulator. It's pretty simplified. Inside part number 4 here are some smaller Motif-developed electronics that are kind of more complex. But otherwise, it's basically a circuit board and some supporting structures, a few wires that cross out of the device to electrodes, a peak housing, and then not pictured here is that the whole thing is filled with a medical-grade epoxy to help improve its strength and kind of waterproofness. When we talk about interfaces and challenges on those, I think some of the things that, again, are easy to overlook are those material-to-material interfaces. So the question here for this device is, well, how do you get part number 2 to interface with or lock into part number 1, and how do you make that hermetic or waterproof? And you can talk about ultrasonic welding, and we can get this whole thing enclosed, but that enclosure is not enough. You need to also fill it with that medical grade epoxy that I talked about, Med 301. And the problem that you run into is that Med 301 and this peak enclosure have different coefficients of thermal expansion. And so when you build this device on the bench, it's great, everything works. You can even test this in an animal, and it works pretty well for a while. And then it heats up, and that internal epoxy expands a bit more and presses on the kind of borders or barriers of this case and pops it open a little bit. And this is one of the challenges that we had to design and develop around. We had to think about what our curing process for Med 301 was and how we handled those kind of differences in material heating rate. And I think this is an example of some of those materials challenges that are easy to overlook when you're designing on bench or thinking about ahead of time. And you can think about these types of process challenges very early on in your device design, but we're often not taught to do that when we're first developing prototypes. We kind of are taught to make it work, or we're taught to be experimental and just kind of like fiddle until we get to something that gets the signal or the acquisition that we want. But I think the thing that I'll try to bring in today is that you can look at these sort of process challenges really early on in development, and kind of guiding or kind of seeing development through that lens makes you a stronger neuroengineer, if you want to call yourself that, overall. So let's take a look at some other examples of these types of challenges. We talked a little bit there, or I kind of started touching on manufacturing as a challenge. I see manufacturing as this sort of systematic noise injector. Any sort of designs that you're putting together that can't be made reliably basically are not going to be viable to actually commercialize or bring to market. And I think it's easy to think about this being a problem to solve later, like do all the design and then we'll figure out how to manufacture it. But I think really good companies and really good engineers think about manufacturability really early on in device design. One of the challenges that we had occasionally at BlackRock that we eventually fixed was how early we brought manufacturing as a department into our design process. Early on when we started the company, manufacturing came in phase 5 out of 5 phases. into our design process. So we would basically do all of the design, we would do all of our testing, and then we would hand it to manufacturing and say, hey, make this. And that was never worked out very well. And I think when you think about the types of challenges you have in manufacturing, and if you can bring those into your engineering and design process, you can remove a lot of those issues that we had in translation. So this is an example, a kind of toy example of some of the sources of variability that we have that affect our manufacturing process for Motif's device. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but I just want to kind of talk about some of them and how some of these can be predicted early on or thought about as we go through the design process. So starting off with step number one, purchasing materials. Oftentimes the way a lot of labs operate, or even a lot of companies that have engineers designing things, is this sort of ability to freely select vendors and materials that they want to use for their device design. They'll order from whoever will kind of give the material that seems right on paper. They'll order from those people and start building with it. And the assumption there is that you eventually get to a place later where somebody else will figure out how to source that material reliably or get the right material that meets the specifications you outlined. But if you do that thinking really early on, you can reduce that challenge that comes with changing your materials vendor later or changing the source of the material. If you can understand those actually needs, that specification window, what kind of variance you're going to have in your material purchases and design, then you can build feasibility units in your design process that actually challenge the limits of that material's operations or like specifications. And so I think there's a lot of risk you can reduce and challenge in translation just by thinking about those types of things early on in the process. Later in the process, we have a laser cutting step. There's all sorts of inputs into this process that we could adjust. We can adjust things like cut speed and intensity and the passes and the depth of the cut and the exposure time. And these things result in pretty like predictable and measurable outputs. Our laser cut determines the dimensions of the thing that we're cutting out. They determine the strength of the unit depending on how thick we cut it, for example. But there's all sorts of sources of variability in here that are hard to understand or think about or control for, such as the humidity of the room or the particulates generated by the laser cutting process and how those affect the cut ability or like how cuttable or efficient the cutting is. There's also like issues like the laser's source degrading over time. Now, some of these things don't necessarily immediately affect your design, but these are the types of challenges that you'll have to work on to understand if that process that you're doing, that laser cutting that you're doing, is affected to or sensitive to these things. So coming back to that idea or that case study of working at BlackRock and working on thin film electrodes, some of the big challenges that we had was that we had an ISO 7 class clean room, so it controlled particulate. We thought that would be good enough to build all of our neural implants in. And then we went to build some of our thin film electrodes and realized they couldn't be built very well in this class of clean room, that we needed a higher class of clean room to control particulate even further to be able to get the reliability of the small traces that we were building on our devices. And so it's these types of things that are important to acknowledge, I guess, in translation, thinking about where variety can come from, how you can control it. And that can affect, again, design, right? If you're designing electrode paths and you want to be able to build this in an easier clean room because the purpose of the electrode is to be able to make it cheaper, then maybe you need to build thicker electrode paths so that they can be built in less strict clean rooms. And these are getting very in the weeds and very specific, but I think it's the process of thinking through this, of kind of like planning into the future about what that purpose of the device is, so that you're not just thinking about how design meets that purpose, but how process meets that purpose. So there's a million things I could talk about on process challenges that we've had with this device in moving into translation. But examples of these include heat budget. This is one that's not thought about as often in device development as well. Several of these components in here are sensitive to heat, but the device is also made of curable epoxies. Those epoxies require certain cure temperatures. And so as we're developing the internals of this device and thinking about order of assembly, we have to be able to have those internal components survive the ultimate epoxy heating temperatures. And so if you're in a situation where you have an electronics team that's working on one thing and you have a software team that's working on another, and then you have your enclosure team working on another, it's very easy to lose sight of these overall process impacts. And so again, the earlier you can bring in that kind of collaborative discussion between those different groups, the more that you can set to avoid these. So we later learned that we could heat treat the internal components of the device to make them more robust against that future epoxy heating. But that was a hard learning that we didn't do quite right the first time. And so I think the kind of main point of my argument here is that early process management thinking could really rapidly accelerate like lab prototypes that we're making to first in human work. And I think for me, coming out of school, one of the main things I was missing was an example of this type of process management thinking. We think a lot about design. We think about designing for like user needs. We're like taught that, I think, a little bit more often in school because it's the fun thing to think about. Think about what the user is going to do with the device and how you develop a device that meets that use, how you develop requirements around it. But we don't often think about manufacturing process control because it's not as fun. But it's also not something we have to like do as much. We're not doing high volume manufacturing in our academic labs. And so I guess I would encourage you to seek out the like experience of being able to sit down in a risk management process with a medical device company and look at how they think about process risk and how they control it and how you could think about that earlier in device design. Going on to other things in the translation pipeline that often get people gotchas in the translation pipeline are regulations. I put them in quotes because I think oftentimes medical device or new engineers kind of look at regulations and hand wave them away as like some big category of just external things that somebody else has to deal with. Regulations really are not that special. Most of the regulations we have in medical devices are just encouraging you to have a good design process. So they actually encourage this exact type of thinking, right? To think about manufacturing process early in your device design, to think about user needs, to connect these pieces together. And so a lot of regulations and standards just exist to build in systematic thinking and defensible decisions. And I think this is something that, I'm not going to go to the slide yet. I think this is something that's, again, easy to overlook or not do often in proof of concept or early academic devices because, again, it's usually one person working on the project. All the decisions are in our head. And so the like need to make documentation is not really there. But if we can kind of train ourselves to document our thinking and decision making and log that through the process, this itself is practice, I think, for industry medical device design. And that's all these regulations are really encouraging us to do. I think this is a graphic or something like this that a lot of you have probably seen, this sort of like V of the design process, starting out at early concept and moving into actually validating and verifying the outputs. But I think a lot of people kind of skip around through this process. They think of high-level concepts and they jump into development really early, and then they move into testing. But if your requirements aren't written really well for that testing, then that testing doesn't end up proving a lot. You have to prove that testing against risk management. You have to prove it against your detailed design concepts. And so I think the more practice people can get in seeing kind of both sides of this V and connecting them to each other, the better. I'm going to skip over this. No, I'll go with this example. At BlackRock, I got to deal with my first FDA recall. That was a fun one. I think BlackRock's only had one, and it was this one. It was a labeling issue, which is the most common cause of recalls, and probably not something that is that exciting to think about as an engineer and scientist. But they're connected, right? Coming back to this idea of this V, one of the things regulations or these standards like 1345 encourage you to do is to create all these traceable links between what your requirements are, what your design outputs are, what your testing is to prove or show that those meet those requirements. And oftentimes flowing out of that, or maybe connected in that process, is labeling itself. So when BlackRock thinks about what its device requirements are, it's thinking about what type of stimulation it has to have, how isolated it has to be based on what the area of the body we're stimulating, what sort of safety factors are required. And in doing that, you define this level of applied part. The problem that BlackRock had, and maybe this is an oversimplification, is that we didn't fully have that link in place between that requirement, the testing that we did for it, and the label that we were controlling. So eventually somebody realized that the requirement should change, and that changed, or the testing should change, I should say, and that changed the label that we ultimately had. But it was kind of incorrectly done. We weren't supposed to have that level of safety label, even though we had set a requirement that said that we did, and we didn't have the level of testing necessary to prove that level of applied part safety. And so we had to recall everything we had in the field, reapply labels to all of it and send it back out to people, which is not a fun process. But I think the thing to take away is that really thinking about how these things link to each other and getting practice in doing that linkage, seeing examples of how companies do it, is itself a really important skill to build and not something that you really get through classwork. I'll talk a little bit about regulations in our pituitary gland stimulator. Oftentimes when people think about regulations, they think about FDA or regulatory bodies as a police force, somebody who comes in and tells you, oh, you can and you cannot do that. In reality, that's not how FDA tends to operate. What they're really trying to do is to get you to think hard. So instead of actually auditing your specific tests or outputs or your specific conclusions, they're mostly auditing your thinking. And so what FDA's audits often look like is they get you to go back and walk through your thinking. And so even if you have something that is, what is the right way to put this? FDA mostly wants to see that you're following your own processes that you've designed or developed. And in doing that, they'll walk through those processes with you and have you prove that you're following that type of thinking. And what they're looking for is thinking that encourages high quality decision making. So a lot of regulations basically say, well, you need to have documents reviewed by people, and they have to be reviewed by people with the right expertise, and enough of them have to review them that multiple people have looked at them. And as long as you've done that, you've enforced that type of process, then FDA will tend to trust the decisions or conclusions that you come up with. And I bring that up in this example because when we were building this pituitary stimulator, which was a sort of Frankenstein unit of several different off-the-shelf medical device parts, it's kind of like by-the-book regulations, or when people think about regulations and the typical testing you do for a medical device, if you weren't kind of paying attention to what regulation said, would say there would be all sorts of new testing we should do. We should test the device in this specific location. We should test the fact that we're crossing this sphenoid bone and what infection risk that could lead to. We should do these stimulation patterns in animal testing to make sure they didn't hurt adrenal function or whatever pituitary function. There'd be all these tests that we'd be sort of recommended to do. But when you look at the thinking that we did as a team to think about the actual risks there and the patient population they affected, we came to the conclusion that no, you can justify this with literature. There's good data out there on pituitary removal that shows that even a misstimulation wouldn't necessarily cause significant issues. You can justify that this externalized stimulator in this patient population, which were terminal cancer patients, is justified for humane use. There's all these arguments that you can make that ultimately resulted in a thumbs up from all the regulatory bodies because they're like, yeah, we've realized that you guys have gone through this kind of thinking, this specific structured thinking around this challenge and the actual risks and benefits involved. So again, there's no by the book set of tests or regulations or things you need to specifically comply to as much as it is having disciplined and structured thinking that is high quality and defensible. And so oftentimes when I'm talking to people about regulations, I'm encouraging them not to become extremely knowledgeable about compliance to standards, but rather to become very good at documenting their thinking. Because that's ultimately what I think what most regulations are asking you to do. And I think with that point, I also want to point out that there's a risk there of not so ethical behavior, right? It can become very easy to groupthink yourselves into trying to get your project over the finish line or minimizing a risk in your mind because that makes it easier. Those things will often go through FDA approval. It doesn't mean they're necessarily the ethical or right thing to do. And while FDA does exist to help, protect the public from this type of misthinking, it's not always done well. Because again, they're not holding you to some sort of specific standard that they police. They're trying to get you to hold yourself to your own standards most of the time. And so I think when you're thinking about project design and how the technologies you're developing, you have to think about who determines risk and how that risk is thought about, because ultimately it's you that's making those determinations. And so I'd encourage you to work with people who are values aligned to what you want to do and that are thinking through these things carefully. I think one of the last points I'll make on clinical value or translation is to remember that clinical value is defined by human use. I think in the lab, I see a lot of people get really excited about the newest technologies or the ones that are somehow offer the most scientific insight, for example, high electrode counts or complex devices that have high sampling rates. These things are exciting and they're very cool and they're needed. We need to keep working on pushing the boundaries of technology. But they're not necessarily the same thing that patients optimize for. Patients often are optimizing for low burden, whereas engineers often, in my experience, optimize for metric performance, data throughput, for example, or fidelity. Those things don't always necessarily matter. And what we see is that human factors wash out many of the aspects of device design or reliability that we typically work on. So you might have, for example, this really great device that has this cool deep learning model, and it works really well if you can grab 24 hours of data from the patient every day. So they just need to wear the thing 24 hours and they have to upload their data every day, and the deep learning model will improve by 10%, and it's awesome. And nobody's going to do that. Adherence and misuse and training issues and patients not wanting to wear the device when they're on vacation will all affect all of this work that you want to do. And these things also have to be thought of, therefore, early on when we're thinking about what those types of benefits are that we're generating. Finally, I'll point out that people do not always behave rationally in selecting medical care. This one might be well known at this point, but when patients are asking about deep brain stimulators, does somebody know the first question they ask or what their most common question is? Can people see it? How does it look? The brain surgery is not the scary part. It's their friends and family thinking that they're weird for having an implant or knowing that they have a medical issue. And so we think about sometimes that people are going to operate or choose things according to risk. You hear our industry talk all the time about minimally invasive implants and how this is going to massively increase adoption. I'm not so sure. I think implants that are easy to use, that are easy to put in, that don't require multiple surgeries or follow-up tuning visits or things like that will attract more patients. I'm going to skip that slide and go to an example. The Motif device is a wearable device. It's actually built on this idea that I just talked about, which is that patients tend to adopt technologies that are easier or lower burden for them. You can actually think about the Motif device as an implantable TMS device. TMS being transcranial magnetic stimulation. To get TMS treatment, a patient has to go to the clinic 5 to 10 days in a row for hours a day. And this is actually just straight up not possible for most patients. So there's tons and tons of patients who want TMS, who would benefit from TMS, who are good candidates for TMS, and they can't get it. But they'd be willing to get a hole in their head, an implant, because it is actually easier for them. It takes less time overall and less time away from their family or away from their job. It's more accessible. So it's not that it's cool and has a, like we in Motif sometimes we talk about like, oh, we can record neural data directly epidurally, and so we're going to get much higher quality neural data than we were getting from TCDS or these other kind of external devices. But in reality, the patients are excited about the fact they don't have to go to the clinic 5 days a week. So what does this mean for designing neurotechnology? Again, kind of the same takeaway I've been trying to emphasize through this talk is that translation is not a phase of developing a new technology. It's a lens through which to view technology design. And so if you can think about translation, if you can think about all these kind of challenges, whether it be regulatory and how they think about risk, or whether it's epoxy mating interfaces, or whether it's manufacturing issues that you could run into, the earlier you can think about those in your design, I think the better your design is going to be, and the faster these technologies can move out of proof of concept into translated technologies. Put differently, I think great engineers design for failure modes. If you can design things that reduce uncertainty, you advance quickly. And that's my conclusion. So, thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Paper Tigers from online asks, what is the hermeticity of the Motif device? Is it like the military standard for hermeticity? Thinking like devices like PMA working from patterns.
Yeah, it's a good question. So you noticed that I talked about a peak enclosure with epoxy filling. The device is not completely hermetic. It's near hermetic. What do we mean by near hermetic? Effectively, everything eventually wets. So even your titanium deep brain stimulator, water will cross through that over to the electronics. It's just that the timeline for that is like 650 years or something. For our device, it's probably faster. How fast? We don't necessarily fully have data on it yet, but over greater than 4 years, we'll say. And so it's a shorter lifetime, but it's a good enough lifetime for what the device is used for. And so coming back to that idea of designing to meet requirements, it meets requirements and it works for what patients are willing to accept for device replacements. Yeah.
How exactly do they find anchor to the skull?
So the implant is floating when it's first put in, and it is then pressed against the dura through a series of silicone spacers. They're like little O-rings, effectively. People have different thicknesses of skulls. The implant's a fixed height. So we drop the implant into the burr hole, calculate the difference between that and the thickness of the skull, drop in spacers, and then put a cap on it, effectively. So that cap with the spacers fixes it in place against the dura. Yeah.
If you're able or willing to share, did Motif consider applying for breakthrough device designation, or what was the thought process of that? What are you getting breakthrough device?
Yeah, so we do not have breakthrough device designation yet. Breakthrough device is, so for those of you not aware of it, breakthrough device is effectively a program that companies can apply to say that they have breakthrough technology. It has to meet a few specific criteria, specifically that it's in the best interest of patients and affects a disease that is potentially life-threatening, I believe. I can't remember all the criteria. But you basically have to meet the primary criteria as well as one of the criteria from category B. The advantage of applying through and getting that granted are, first off, you get more frequent and faster meetings with the FDA. So it makes regulatory conversations with the FDA quicker and easier. The other advantage is that in reimbursement and later on getting kind of payment for your device, there are several pathways that might make that easier if you have breakthrough designation. Motif did apply for breakthrough designation. The FDA actually invited us to because they're excited by the technology. And we applied at a very bad time. We applied in January 2025. And I don't know if you know what was going on in the FDA around February 2025, but there weren't a lot of people there. And they sent us a very strangely formatted letter back that said, with everything that's going on, it's very confusing here. This application is denied, basically. So we did not get breakthrough, but I don't think it was because we don't have a breakthrough technology. Yeah.
So you were talking about TMS and how it, in your typical device, that isn't it. And have you thought about non-invasive ways to recreate that to improve like patient adherence? Because, well, now I can still get the same treatment. I don't need surgery. So TCS, different variants, stuff like that.
Yeah. So actually our technology is already doing that. So Flow Neuroscience, I think, just released a bunch of data on QCDS for depression. The effects are moderate, and I don't think we fully understand why that is. I think best guess is the localized stimulation is important, and TMS facilitates that, and an implant that stimulates epidurally facilitates that. Whether that's possible through other technologies, I think remains to be seen. I think focused ultrasound, for example, might be able to be a little bit more targeted, even though it's non-implantable. It's hard to say. So Motif did consider that early on. Coming back to that kind of point on device design, the current version of Motif requires a wearable. We anticipate that we won't need a wearable always, and the patients will be able to recharge devices that make so they don't have to do anything for 10 minutes a day. Yeah.
From Excel, there have been many other brain stimulation devices or a popular book was Hum Neurotech a couple of years ago, and I believe it failed in 2022. What typically kills brain stimulation started, even after they've had some initial success?
Yeah. Yeah. There's lots of things that kill companies. I've been part of good companies that the technology was doing fine, but the company dies because of the team. That's not unusual. Co-founder conflicts are a big deal and can usually kill companies. Inability to secure fundraising sometimes comes from co-founder conflict or comes from an unfit founder. Any one of those things can be things that kill companies that are unrelated to technology at all, basically. I think a lot of companies die also due to lack of focus. As scientists, it's easy to start a company and kind of explore all the different options that are available. You can pursue grants, you can do collaborative projects with other people. Kind of even speaking, not even within neurotechnology, I've started companies in other places or other industries. And usually the hard time people have is a lack of focus. They try to chase every type of lead or every type of opportunity, and in that dilution, don't achieve their main purpose. The way that kind of pans out, I think, for startups in a deep tech space like neurotech is they end up not committing enough resources quickly enough to the right pathway. And so they don't reach milestones with the cash burn that they have. They end up either doing a kind of crappy job of hitting those milestones. So they'll do like bad testing or not get all the data they were supposed to. And they'll end up with subpar stories that hurts their fundraising or hurts their ability to submit a good regulatory application or something else. Yeah.
find teams that are aligned values. You talked about that being like,
Yeah.
part of the FDA, making the FDA process easier,
Yeah.
but I don't know, in the current job market, you don't have a lot of flexibility to pick and choose where you want to be or who you want to work with.
Yeah.
You're talking about like green flags.
Yeah, good question. That's a hard one. I think maybe the first response I would give to that is early in your career, it can be valuable to be willing to move. I know people get concerned about being labeled as a job hopper or something, but I think more people have grown to accept that as the reality of today. And I think there's value in it because you get to experience a lot of different things that lets you see the teams you like, the things that are important to you, the type of work that you want. So I think being willing to jump around and move to different companies is useful. I think in selecting teams that are value aligned, I know you're kind of hinting at the fact that job market's tough and there's only so many opportunities. I will say that I think in talking about your values or kind of recognizing what your values are, what you think is important in a team or a manager or a coworker, can help open up opportunities or secure them. I think talking about values is kind of part of networking. It's what leads you to find people that are similar to you, that care about the same things that you do. And so people are excited when they find people that fit their values and they want to bring them in to work with them. I know that's like a really soft, squishy answer. But I think being willing to think about and thinking about your values ahead of time and how that aligns with teams you're going for is in itself part of the like process. Yeah.
With the currently approved systems, if the patient has any medication or any real lifestyle changes, they have to refit. And is that really an issue with the implantable system?
Good question. Time will tell, I guess. So we're entering our first multi-patient clinical trial, hopefully in the next few months. And so I think we'll have more information on that and whether that's a concern. I think if I understood your question correctly, we see that as low risk for us. We think a lot of the kind of targeting challenges in TMS is more about the fact that you do have to retarget, and that if you get target right the first time, science doesn't seem to suggest that that target moves or changes actually. If I understood your question correctly.
And from what I know, currently with lifestyle, if you changing medication or certain lifestyle changes, they always bring them to refit.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's overabundance of caution for the early recovery systems. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that influence that. Part of it is our healthcare system and how doctors make money and how people like seek out med management visits and like treatment opportunities for patients to kind of have touch points. Some of it might just be an overabundance of caution. Some of it might just be like waiting for additional evidence to understand whether you do or do not need to do that. I'm not quite sure of the reason or answer fully. Yeah.
It was great to hear about the, incorporating, think about manufacturing, actually building technology through development. I think, your examples of working within a company make a lot of sense as to kind of including them at phase early on phases. But thinking about for students, how do you think students can better get exposure to thinking about manufacturing or kind of having those kinds of processes as part of their learning? Yeah,
it's a good question. Like, I feel like my cop-out answer is to be like, go intern somewhere, like go like get experience looking at a PFMEA and a master validation plan. Like, I think that would be, I think that's like a great answer in that, like, if you could do that, it's the right move. I also think a lot of companies would invite that. I think a lot of interns want to like show right up onto like design team or something and be in this kind of like, or a data analysis position. Those are cool. I think I don't hear like my manufacturing team doesn't get internship requests, right? Like at least not as often. And so I think there's probably like room there. You could seek something like that out and it would be like interesting to see. I also think it's something that is just like readable. Like you can go learn about process failure mode and effects analysis. Like maybe it's taught here, I'm not sure. But that type of like risk management and thinking about how you control those and think about those, like that's readable. There's classes on it, little micro classes online and stuff. And so I think both of those are opportunities to do that. Yeah.
If I understand it correct, you've worked, fully in person at jobs, but then also currently you're in a different state than a lot of your team. What, additional challenges or, problems or even benefits does that cause?
Yeah. So at BlackRock, I was in person. I live here in Salt Lake City. I like Utah too much to leave. I'm in a very beneficial place in my career that any new team I work with, I get to tell them I will not leave Utah. So if you want to work together, I'll be remote, which is a kind of nice thing. But it does come with its own challenges. So BlackRock, we were all in person. It was easy. We were getting in conference rooms. We were sitting at benches together. Pandemic happened. Tried to start a company during the pandemic. We would mail circuit boards to each other to like test them and like upload firmware to them and stuff. It was garbage. It was not a good time. But it worked. We did like build a thing. We like built a test system. I then went on to work at a company called NeuroMatch, where we were all remote, and we encouraged remoteness, like even when people lived near each other. So I happened to live in the same city as my project manager. Her and I had a rule though that we wouldn't like co-work together, so that we could have everything be fair for the whole company. And I think that's where I'll kind of comment on that first, which is in person's easy, all remote is easy. Hybrid is hard. It's really hard. Motif is hybrid, and it's hard. I don't know how comfortable my team is with me speaking on their interpersonal dynamics, but there are people like at the company who are very frustrated by the remote people, because like every once in a while the remote person's like, hey, like I can't test that. Can you go like into the lab and like test that on the bench for me? And so those people like de facto become these like taskers or whatever, like they get tasked with things and just have to go around and execute. And that's like, everybody like loves that for their job. They want more autonomy. So that's frustrating. And then the person on the other side is frustrated because they're like waiting for results. They can't do things as quickly as they want. And that makes the company a little bit slower. At the same time, the trade-off or advantage is that we've gotten to pull from a really wide talent pool. You can get really great people who are very good at certain things or very good at the specific thing that you need for your company. And so you can cast a much wider talent net. I think if you're going to go hybrid, there are certain practices that make it easier. And some of those practices are hard and don't come naturally to people, especially if it's their first job, which for a number of people at Motif, they're fresh out of a PhD program or something and they're here. I think the main practice that makes hybrid work easier is making communication more similar, or like a similar experience for everybody in the company. So even though you're working in person, if you document more, if you use like chat apps more, if you like write more, it makes so that everybody's kind of on the same foot. And that was like the big lesson from NeuroMatch, because we were all remote, but we were also global. We had people in the US and Korea and Italy and Canada and Japan. You just can't get in a meeting together. It's not possible. And so you get really good at writing. And I guess that's how I would see hybrid companies needing to operate, is getting really good at documentation. Motif's partially there. Yeah.
How would the whole legal process be like the market service stuff? If everyone's is changing, you have like a cellular or tissue based,
I didn't hear the very beginning of your question. So I think the question was, I talked about interfaces in one of my earlier slides and kind of the challenges of interfacing. And I think you were asking about a tissue-based implant or like a. Yeah, so this is not quite my area of expertise. So like drugs and biologics, not really my expertise. I've done active coatings on devices, but I'm very device oriented. And I'm only a moderately good engineer by any measure. I will say that the process is all the same, right? The challenge of thinking about the way that you interface with the body and what can happen to those interfaces, what types of risks or hazards come up with them, is all going to be the same. FDA is going to challenge you to the same thinking and thinking about risk. So really not a lot of the points change. Examples of additional challenges you might have or I have had in working on things with more active coatings is thinking about lifetime and shelf life and stability and how you get those things to remain stable before as you manufacture them and before you get them to the implant site. Again, an easy thing to overlook when you're working on the bench because you go like make the thing in the reactor or something, right? And you go like put it into the animal like immediately. Being able to come up with a way that you can make those things somehow shelf stable and transportable and storable is hard. And even if you come up with a solution for it, thinking about how that solution intersects with the realities of hospitals or the places that can implant them and who's capable of doing that if you have an interface that looks like that. I don't know if that fully answered the question. Maybe to give a little bit more example. When we're thinking about translating technology, you're also thinking about commercializing it. Who can actually use it and what kind of facilities do they have? So one of the first things we had to do at Motif is how many neurosurgeons are there in the US? How many places that have neurosurgical suites in their hospitals exist? How far are those from how many people? How many people are going to be willing to drive to get an implant for that? Those questions became answerable. And for us, it was pretty easily like, yeah, there's enough of them. I don't know what kind of limitations exist for other types of implants that have other types of limitations. They may be able to only be implanted in certain types of ORs that meet certain standards. And that might present a challenge for how you actually translate. Yeah.
We have a few more questions online. The first one, does the dot device, which is implemented over the cortex, also record like if so, what would be the sources of those signals?
So the first version of dot doesn't record. Second version of dot does. Motif has actually an active grant. I think this is public knowledge. I feel like I'm going to get criticized by people at my company after this. We have an active grant with ARIA, which is an organization in the UK, government organization in the UK, to develop a recording version of the system. And we've already prototyped that and tested that.
ARIA just brings protocol.
Yeah, basically.
The second question is, what temperature do you mandate the epoxy to withstand? And what is the butcher number of your dose?
I don't know that last word.
Number is either, but maybe you know a bit about the epoxy.
Yeah. So our epoxy is cured at 65, 65C. So it's not that hot, but there's a lot of materials inside the device that are pretty sensitive. We've had to alter, there's many cases where you have to alter your process to comply with that type of heat budget. So for example, a lot of devices that have batteries in them, the batteries aren't meant to go past 65. And so for a safety factor, they end up having to cure their devices at 55, which is like not the recommended cure temperature for some of the medical grade epoxies. And so a lot of companies are using like off temperature cures to build their devices. So it's not uncommon. You just have to prove that it's safe, right? So you could do all your animal testing and you show, even though you haven't cured to that quote unquote biocompatible temperature from the manufacturer, it still works. Yeah.
Talked a lot about how application should focus, and also this translation as kind of a lens, not a goal. And I think it's interesting how the device kind of exists in this niche, halfway between like really implantable, really invasive, and completely non-invasive. I'm curious about kind of how did kind of fitting that niche of that in between device start, or kind of the target of depression and your clinical target, kind of like which came first, and you kind of choose the device niche and then the target?
That's a great question. So the answer is we chose the form factor and implantability first. So principle being we know that there's cortical stimulation targets that are going to have effects. We know that those are valuable and there's clinical value to them already because we see that in other technologies. And we see that in TMS even, right? And so then the idea was, how do we make a device that's going to be maximally translatable, or like easy, which basically means like easy to build, easy to implant, easy to sell, easy to train. And we ended up with a device that looks more like this one. And this was like based off of some of the unique advantages that we have. So for example, we have this proprietary and internally developed power transfer method that comes from Jacob Robinson's lab, who's our CEO. And so we're capable of transmitting more power at higher densities in smaller devices. And so we're like, okay, we need to make something that's small. We want to keep it. We can transmit through a longer range than a lot of coil-based technology. So we can like deal with people's hair and skin and stuff that's above their head. We don't need an IPG that's like right at the surface of the skin, like a DPS device does. So we can be cranial. And so we thought about those unique advantages of our technology and how they worked into a device that was translatable. So the motif form factor, which is a slide I kind of skipped, is developed to fit a perforator. So a cranial perforator that a neurosurgeon uses. There's off-the-shelf ones that come with certain sizes. This is like such a picturesque like user needs example, but it's like, okay, people typically use this. They want devices, therefore, that fit a 14 millimeter perforator. And so we developed the device profile to fit against that. And so this means that a surgeon doesn't have to have a special tool. They don't need to learn a new process. Every neurosurgeon makes like 5 perforator holes a day. And so they're using that exact same technique and they can drop our device in. And so instead of being a really difficult process like the RNS, which so many surgeons complain about and refuse to do, and it's like not even really acceptable in Europe because it is so difficult to implant, this device is meant to be easy to drop in. So then it's like, okay, we have this easy to drop in device. Where's the best market opportunity? And where is the greatest like market gap for people who are looking for treatment? And for that, we saw treatment-resistant depression.
As a follow-up to that, do you have another target you're looking at and kind of while thinking about maintaining focus in the company, like when would you look at a different target?
Yeah. So the way we kind of see when we're developing commercialization plans, or when I'm developing commercialization plans, I try to encourage companies to think about the kind of meta commercialization plan. Like, what is your technology roadmap? Like, how does your company grow? For some companies, like drugs, like they grow through new formulations, right? So the faster they can spin up those formulations and the new ones they can test, and the quicker they can test those new formulations, the better. And so that's why companies like Recursion were like seen as really valuable, right? Because they optimize that loop. For Motif, we saw the kind of meta commercialization plan as one device, multiple targets, or like moving target, right? So if you can take this one device and drop it into different cranial locations, then great, this like platform technology we developed works for lots of different places and cases. And DBS has the same argument, and so do other things like TMS, which can stimulate many places in the brain. So it's not special that we thought of that, but it is a defining aspect of our company. So to answer your question, like TRD is the first one. It has a really specific, well-known target, but it's kind of cool because we basically get to follow around TMS, which like validates the things that we want to stimulate on. And we get to do those as well. The advantage we might have against TMS in the future, or where we could kind of go beyond that and go beyond TMS's science, is multi-target stimulation. That could be a unique advantage of our platform. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on that. So an important part of these neurostimulation devices is where you're stimulating and where you're targeting stimulation to. And I guess there's a lot of research in DBS, TNS, how to like personalize that targeting. And I guess maybe that's separate from your device, but I'm curious how you're thinking about that. Like what role does neuroimaging play in that? And like how much do you dive into the research in that area to work like how to instruct the surgeons?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it touches on other aspects of translation that are kind of finicky. So for us, there's this weird trade-off that we have where you want a device that is easiest possible to target, right? Like the patient doesn't have to go to a bunch of imaging studies. The surgeon can put it in quickly and easily. At the same time, we've recognized this interesting user need where a lot of psychiatrists are very interested in technologies that are more personalized. And they might be more likely to adopt a technology that is more personalized or appears more personalized, even if we haven't yet proven that that personalization leads to like a significant difference. And so this is kind of an odd thing for us to reconcile because you're trying to deal with like burden of healthcare, but also this user need, and they're like opposing. And so we're early on in our company, right? We're moving to our first clinical trial, but we've had to sort of think carefully about how much we lean to one or the other side of that. Because again, coming back to that idea of lack of focus, you can't just go like prove all of it. Like it would be inefficient, for example, for us to sit out and prove that personalized therapy is better somehow. Like, why would we be creating a scientific argument against ourselves? Like, there's nobody that cares about it. The patient just wants to be treated. The psychiatrist just wants something to treat the patient, and the surgeon just wants to implant it. Like, they don't need to see that specific evidence. And so the path we kind of have to pick is, do we develop a personalized therapy out the gate, or do we pick something that is like simpler out the gate? And to be honest, I don't think Motif has fully picked that yet. But to answer your question on targeting, the nice advantage we have, again, following TMS around is that there's a lot of info out there on TMS and how you target it and fiduciary markers and like all these things that we can orient to. We have to pick among those which one we want to use, but there's a lot of good options and they'll probably all work. Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. So it's like that one's easy. Is it good enough? Probably. Is it going to be what's maximally adopted? Who knows? Yeah, and also sometimes, right? So it's like, how do you get more specific than that, or what's sufficient? What's a good enough responder rate? It's a bunch of hard choices to make, and I find those to be the kind of squishiest, hardest places of company strategy discussion because there's not a knowable right answer. Yeah.
With these devices, is there any interest with trying to make them like MRA out of their state, which have very little sense?
Yeah. So I think it's a pretty strong user need that a lot of cranial devices or devices that are in the skull, surgeons want them, physicians basically want them to be MRI safe or MRI compatible. Our device is in a sort of maybe unique advantage for that spot because we don't have a metal enclosure around our device, which kind of simplifies it a little bit. So we've done some initial MRI testing with our device and have results that show that it's MRI safe, but it does cast a little bit of a shadow. So I don't know if you can call it fully MRI compatible.
Do you have any good documentation practices for FDA audits or just implementation?
Yeah. I don't know how to fully answer that because it's a big question. I will say that you can't, it's not really possible to like under document, or sorry, it's not really possible to over document. Effectively writing everything down and linking it to like why you made a choice or what you're thinking about is almost always going to be the right move. Any place that you can write a justification for why you established something or thought about something is valuable. I think there's a lot of templates you'll see out there that try to simplify things. So like you'll see a user needs template or a design requirements template that merely just try to show you the traceability from like user need to requirement to whatever. I really prefer templates, and I think it's valuable that have justification for every one of those steps, right? Every single thing you think about, like, why did I choose this? Where did it come from? So for example, a lot of times we write down user needs, and like that's kind of where we start. But like if you can connect those to your user interviews and who you talked to and why you chose to talk to that person, like that is valuable. Every piece of kind of linking of why is useful. And I haven't seen any of that come back to really harm a company yet. I think there's some arguments that could be made, like potentially you can over document failure. Like some companies will choose to be kind of strategic about when they're really moving into formal testing and they don't log all of their like preliminary testing results. I don't think I'm experienced enough. Maybe I haven't worked at big enough companies to say when and how and why that would be a move to take. I think it doesn't hurt to document too much. Yeah.
But you It seems like that's a little bit of a shift in focus, and you talk about like point B focus. I'm doing point
Yeah.
back, what's this even like for
Again, talking a little bit, maybe too much about internal company discussions and politics or whatever. It was a big argument early on in Motif. It was the biggest disagreement we had with each other, was whether record should be part of V1 or not, and how valuable record was as a function. Our team is much more aligned now to it. When we look at our device's kind of unique value propositions in the space, we think recording is an important one. There's actually very few devices that record from DLPFC that might have like more emotional data, for example, in them, or network data from this specific network. And so we see ourselves as having an advantage kind of in the data space due to recording from that section or part of the brain. Additionally, there's a sort of principle that we've aligned on. So coming back to that idea of values and what the purpose of your company is or what the purpose of your work is. We think medical device companies effectively have a duty to make devices that are improvable or updatable, and that they have to be able to learn to get better over time. We see this in like modern technologies, right? We've moved away from just like cars that get firmware updates when you like take them to the dealership once every few years to like always updating cars. And that comes with its own ethical challenges. Tesla withholding battery power or something through firmware updates. But that type of technology, I think, has made cars a lot safer. And you can see that like companies like Tesla or Rivian see their safety data like improve through to these like kind of rapid learning. And we think that same approach has to be true in medical devices. We like owe it to our patients. And so it's like coming back to that idea of values and strategy and mission, record became part of that, not a feature on the roadmap, if that makes sense. And so that helped drive the decision a little bit more clearly.
One more question online. Any interest in motor cortex conditions as well, or is the priority always going to be semiconductor?
Yeah. So Motif, talking about more internal debates at the company. When companies are first forming, they don't fully know what they are. It's nice to imagine that all founders get together in a room and they're like, this is our vision and this is exactly what we'll do. Motif was closer to that than most companies I've been at. It felt amazing to get in a room with Jacob and Steve and some of our early employees like Amanda and Landon. At the same time, like there were discussions really early on. Are we a mental health company? Are we a neural device company? Like which of those things really define us? And I had a really fun time kind of, Jacob's our CEO and truest founder, right? Very first person to think about this and push on launching the company. And so I enjoyed kind of like peppering him with questions to explore that. And I'd go to Jacob and I'd say, would you make a TCDS headband? Would you if you could acquire Headspace, would you acquire Headspace, the mental health app? And like just getting his like visceral response, like no, yes, no, to these different questions helped kind of like form what that like boundary is, like what the company actually is. And early on, one of the questions was TRD versus stroke rehabilitation. And ultimately TRD was the better market opportunity, but it was just the more interested. It was the cause we cared about more as well. The rising rates of like suicide, widespread like mental health issues. These were things that like Jacob and I had personal interest in. And so ended up, I think, also influencing where the company moved in that direction. But to answer that question more crisply, the boundary for Motif is we see our mission or kind of vision is that everybody can have a better life with the neural device. And that can definitely be facilitated by devices that learn. And therefore, something like stroke or motor is within the context of the company.